a scorecard for creating systems value through the Future Fit Business Benchmark. This video walks you through some of the ideas we have around building a scorecard to help businesses goal set and track their progress towards addressing societal challenges in ways that increase the possibility that humans and other life will flourish on Earth forever. This seminar is put together by David Hughes and Brett Knowles. So the concept is about conformance versus performance. Many of the existing triple bottom line frameworks are more about conformance, an assessment tool to make sure that we're conforming to the standard, as opposed to performance. As a simple metaphor, there are really 6 types of scorecards we see in organizations. What we call valuation, scorecards which are developed to improve the valuation of the business by showing invisible elements to the stock market. Navigation scorecards provide information to the organization to enable it to set goals and track its progress towards those goals. Compensation. These are scorecards that present information that's used to reward employees. These are typically SMART indicators which are typically lagging in time. Calibration, used for calibrating your organization against others and benchmarking it against those standards. Evaluation, scorecards used to communicate to external stakeholders so that they can better understand how the organization has historically performed. And then finally, regulation, and this provides information used to comply with regulatory or legislative requirements. So, valuation, navigation, compensation, calibration, evaluation, and regulation. And today's conversation is principally about navigation scorecards. So the Future Fit Business Framework principally supports calibration, but can also be used for both valuation, evaluation, and possibly regulation. But let's talk about a navigation tool. So what's the difference? Well, an assessment tool are a bit like a map that tells us exactly and precisely where we are. Whereas a navigation tool is trying to give us information on how to get from where we are to our target location, and hopefully give us some indication of progress along the way so we can chart how we're doing as we navigate. Another way to think of this is something like getting your car appraised. So you might have it appraised for selling, where someone's going to take a look at it and assess it for a bunch of things and ultimately tell you the value of the car. Ultimately, we'd like to build you a scorecard that will give you information on when you drive the car so that it will attain the highest possible value afterwards. So let's compare those. So let's say for assessing our car, we want to determine how many dents you have and what size those dents are. So someone could come up and assess how many dents you have and chart those by size. But on an ongoing basis, a navigation tool would be something like tracking how many kilometers you drive in the city versus how many you drive in the country. Because obviously driving in the city is much more accident prone. Or even chart how many reported accidents you have. These are both measures you get on an ongoing basis. This is a point-in-time assessment. Maybe I want to understand the paint quality or how much it's been fading over time. Again, I can measure the paint. As a navigational indicator, maybe we'll just chart how many kilometers it's driven, because if it's driven, it's outside. Or maybe how much time it's parked in an inside garage versus outside. Again, ongoing metrics. My final example is maybe I want to know how sturdy the metal is, its quality. And being from Canada, one of the big things that causes our cars to have a short lifespan is they rust out. So I might want to chart how many kilometers that car is driven on salty roads, or just in the wintertime. So on the left we have the measure we'd have in an assessment tool, and on the right, navigational type indicators. Let's now talk about attributes of different measures. So if we think of an assessment tool, they tend to focus on the status as of whatever the assessment date is. So for example, if we take a look at a certain performance level across time, we might set a target level for the Future Fit business benchmark. We might have another one that's the industry best practice, and maybe a third that's your cohort best practice, industry, region, whatever I'm comparing myself to. And then finally, I take a look at our own assessment. So typical assessment frameworks will either look at the performance over a set period of time, let's say the average over the last year, or as of a specific date. So that's a typical assessment framework. In a navigation framework, we're kind of concerned about the performance over time. So in this case, I'll still end up with that average performance, but obviously month on month, I'm going to be making different decisions based on the actual performance. In this case, again, we can see that it's a reliable, stable process, even though it's fluctuating around the overall cohort. Maybe I have an unstable system, or maybe just a variant. In all four of these cases, the assessment score would end up being the same, even though as a navigational viewpoint, these are significantly different. So, what does that tell us? For assessments, the tendency is to look for lagging measures that tell us what has already occurred. Whereas in navigational views, our tendency is to look for leading measures. And those are great because they're actionable. We can do something to impact this so it does not continue its down curve. They're somewhat predictive of the future. But the implication is I need a higher frequency of measurement on a navigation tool than on an assessment tool. Now, let's take a conversation about indicators versus measures. So, what we're interested in is things which are indicative of how business is performing. So in the example I gave you before with a car, the number of kilometers driven in the city is indicative of the likelihood of accidents and dents and scrapes happening. So when we begin using indicators as opposed to measures, we're concerned about the quality of that indicator, or what we call signal strength. So think of your cell phone, right? If you've got the full 5 bars of signal strength, that's a good signal. You can probably have complicated conversations with confidence that the person at the other end can hear what's going on. If you have a low signal strength, only 1 or 2 bars, you might not want to be negotiating your mortgage or a loan or something. So signal strength in the indicator world is really based on 5 attributes. How relevant is the data? So how closely is it correlated to the issue being measured? How measurable it is. Can we get accurate data in a reliable way? Predictive. Is that indicator predictive of future performance? Auditable. Can we go in and independently validate that data? And finally, comparable. Can we use that across multiple situations, entities, time zones, regions, products, and so forth? And what we do is we score the indicators out of 5 against those criteria, and we use that to calculate signal strength. So we may end up using an indicator with a low signal strength because that's the best we can get for now, but we'll target that to be improved later. But we still want leadership to know that particular indicator has a low signal strength, and so the decisions that you make about that should be adjusted accordingly. Now I would like to talk about the fact that other assessment frameworks have already been on this journey. So for example, if we think of Baldrige in North America, they had set up an assessment criteria. So each organization was assessed out of 1,000 points. And the 1,000 points were allocated into each of their 7 categories as follows. And then within those categories, they had elements that broke down the points even further. So that was an assessment framework, as opposed to their scorecard, where eventually organizations would take each of these assessment areas, like workforce focus, and set up a series of ongoing metrics that would indicate how they're performing against that particular Baldrige performance area. Likewise, Lean World, through their 5S audits, have come up with measurement frameworks for assessment and scorecards to report back. 6 Sigma, and so forth. So there's a plethora of management business practices that have already established practices around setting up an assessment framework, and separate from that, the ongoing navigation framework. And most of these frameworks have set up an ecosystem of support frameworks behind them. So for example, in Six Sigma, there's all sorts of e-learning courses, certification programs, 1-week boot camps, there's software, and of course a plethora of consulting organizations have set up. So these frameworks have triggered significant increases in consulting and other support structures to help these organizations out. Another concept to talk about is priority. Not all indicators are of the same value. In fact, we need to help our organizations prioritize their objectives to help them interpret the data. And the best example I can think of is on your dashboard, the check oil light or the check engine light of your car. So here's the thing. If that light goes on, what do you do if you're going to the office? Chances are you pull over to the side, you call the mechanic, and they'll assess your car to find out what's going on. But what if you had a different strategy? What if now you're going to the hospital in an emergency and the check oil light goes on? What do? You keep going. So the strategy informs us how to read the data. As we collect this information on Future Fit Business Benchmark, we also need to guide our participants into its relative priority so that they can focus on the right things and make the right decisions at the right time on their goal towards Future Fit. I also want to talk briefly about how we score. And to begin with, I'm just going to talk about milestone scoring. And the idea is that all scoring is relative to some comparative. So we've already covered that in the Future Fit literature. Comparatives are things like, whatever the Future Fit, gold, silver, bronze standards might be. Other comparatives are things like, what is our organizational target? Maybe we don't target to be gold. Maybe we target to be partway to silver. Our actual performance from last year is another comparative. Maybe best in class for my industry, my cohorts average, my industry average, and so forth. Those are all comparatives, and we use those in a navigational scorecard to plot how we're making progress compared to those other elements. So the actual scoring really fits into one or two formats. I can either calculate how I'm doing as a percentage of that comparative. So for example, I might be at 67% of the Future Fit gold standard. Or another example of an indicator might be I'm 96% of my industry's best practice. Or we can set up a point system like we saw in Baldrige. So for example there, maybe for the same metric, instead of reporting 67%, I earn 5 points at a range from say 50 to 70 percentage. And then at 96%, maybe I earn 8 points. So the point system's kind of cool because it allows us to do a non-linear relationship between the percentage performance and the points, which is important when you approach the Future Fit target level because each percentage point at that level is harder to get. Now what would happen is we would probably, again like in Baldrige, assign some maximum quantity of points for each of the assessment areas, whether I'm looking at the 17 goals or the 21 areas or the 8 initiatives. So if we take a look at these, if I take a look at something like how I'm doing relative to the gold standard, the good news is that comparing myself to the gold standard allows me to show progress towards that ultimate long-term goal. The dilemma though is if I compare myself just to that gold standard, it may be too far away to be inspirational for some organizations. Or maybe the performance of that organization currently is so low that I can't even move the dial a bit. It's just too low. Or the opposite, my performance is so high, it's really hard to see a change in the dial. So what we find to be more useful for most organizations is on an ongoing basis, that scorecard, not compare myself to that long-term gold standard, but instead compare myself to the target I have for that quarter. So what that means is I might be at 67% of the gold standard, but my target for this year is to get to 68%. And therefore, it's way more engaging and way more inspiring for the organization because they're goals that are actually achievable, and I can feel proud of what I've done to move the organization forward. So, prioritization and scoring scales need to be considered when you set up this structure to make sure it's successful and sustains itself. So we're suggesting in the proposed Future Fit for Business framework that we start off with a point system, but probably all objectives inside of that category will be equally scored. And within or across each of the 21 categories, we'll normalize them so they're all roughly equal in value. So we don't get into an argument about whether one of the goals is more important than another one. And then we can see how that works inside of our pilot organizations. Multiple dimensions. So one of the challenges we have with the framework is that there are multiple dimensions. And by dimensions, think of any word you'd say after the word of by. So I want to see sales by region, sales by product, sales by sales rep. In this case, I might want to see performance by the 17 goals, or performance by the 8 system principles, or the 8 business principles, or the 21 Future Fit business goals, or the 5 categories. So the idea is this framework has multiple dimensions to it. And so the scorecard needs to be able to reflect that, because some organizations will gravitate towards one or two or multiple of these frameworks. Or in some cases, there are other frameworks they need to use, like the UN framework, for example, which Bob has already mapped Future Fit to, so that we can add that on as dimensionality against the indicators as well. So that would look something like this, where I might have a scorecard where to begin with I'm looking against the 21 Future Fit goals. And I can see how we're doing overall, green. I can see the trend line in the background here of how that indicator is performing, and our end of period performance level. And in this particular case, I'm looking at it versus target. But in terms of multidimensional, think of it as a cube. I could rotate that and take a look at the other cube and take a look at it by the 5 value creating categories instead. Or again, I could flip it and take a look at it by the 17 goals. Or again, keep rotating the cube and take a look at it by the 8 systems principles. Or flip it again and take a look at it by the 8 business principles. The idea is we need to take those metrics and put it into these different constructs so that different stakeholders can see the Future Fit business benchmark through the lens that they would like to see it with. And of course, this framework also allows it to attach it onto the current financial reporting structures, so it becomes a part of the ongoing business, not a part from it. We hope this has been interesting for you, and we look forward to having further conversations about these principles and begin developing our approach to them through the piloting process.